Hey there guys again. I broke our lecture into two because I was running slightly over an hour on the last lecture. So number one, if you couldn't tell, I was kind of losing my steam, and I knew that it would be better for you guys if you were just watching 1 hour and then another 1 hour rather than trying to sit through 2 hours. So let's get back into what we were talking about last lecture. This lecture should hopefully be shorter. We're just going to talk about the 1980s and kind of give a brief overview of the post-Cold War period. Now, what really killed the Carter presidency was the continued sort of weakness of Jimmy Carter. We have the success of SALT I, but the invasion of Afghanistan proved to many that Carter's policy of moral diplomacy and following in the footsteps of Nixonian détente was a failure. Combined with this, you have the Iranian hostage crisis. In 1979, led by Ayatollah Khomeini, you see radicals in Iran seize control from the Shah. We talked about this last lecture, and take Americans hostage. Those Americans included embassy staff and Marine guards, and they were held for over a year, 444 days. So from late 1979 all the way through 1980, only being released in January of 1981. Their release came after the 1980 election, which of course brought to the presidency Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan, if you look at him, is an interesting character. Reagan had started out life as a Hollywood actor. He had been president of the Screen Actors Guild. Just in passing, I should tell you that is a relatively liberal organization in this country. He had been an anti-communist. But for most of his early career, at least up to the 1960s, he had been outside of politics. However, during the late 50s and early 60s, Reagan starts to take on more of a political stance in his life. He joins, of course, the Republican Party and runs successfully to be governor of the state of California in the 1960s and 1970s. So we have Reagan, who is governor of California, runs for the Republican nomination in 1976. And during this Republican convention, it's a very telling sign. I've actually talked to the campaign coordinator, the fellow who set up the Republican National Convention. He didn't work with any particular candidate, he just worked for the political party. Surprisingly, he lived here in Knoxville for a period of time. And this fellow told me that in 1976, when the Republicans were about to nominate Gerald Ford, who had been serving as the de facto president after the resignation of Richard Nixon, that the crowd was chanting, "Reagan, Reagan, Reagan." And actually, Ford, being the establishment character and Reagan being seen as the outsider, was nominated, and Ford got boos. So it wasn't I guess, a good omen for the Republicans in 1976 and why they lost to Jimmy Carter. Now, throughout the late 1970s, America continued to kind of wallow, if you will, in this post-Vietnam era. And by 1980, the failure of détente, the invasion of Afghanistan, and the wars and revolutions in the Middle East drove many Americans, including blue-collar Democrats. When I say blue-collar Democrats, I'm talking about working-class Democrats. I'm talking about, the Archie Bunker types. Drove them to embrace not just the Republican Party, but the Reagan branch of the Republican Party. Because during the 1980 election, we have a clear distinction between Jimmy Carter, who argued that Americans needed to get used to living with less, and Ronald Reagan, who argued that not only could we rebuild America, that Americans needed to fight against the establishment, again, something that had helped Richard Nixon in 1972, as well as fight against moral decay in this country, which of course helped give rise to what often called the religious New Right. These are Americans who believed that the counterculture, and when I say the counterculture, I'm talking mainly the cultural counterculture that had taken hold in the 1970s. Gay rights, for example, sort of a rejection of the traditional household. Things like these issues right here, many Americans believed were hurting America's future. And so what Reagan did, and if you don't know who Reagan is, of course, here we have Ronald Reagan. Reagan, who won the election, argued that the United States could regain its former glory of the 1950s by embracing a high-tech, computer-driven economy. So this is one of the ironies of the 1980s. Traditional manufacturing jobs continued to decline, going overseas to first countries like Japan and then the so-called Asian tigers of Taiwan, South Korea, and the Pacific Rim. They would later, of course, many of them move to China by the 1990s and 2000s. But instead, the American economy would embrace things like Silicon Valley, Microsoft, Apple, those kind of industries. And this would breed what you might call a new subculture in this country. I don't know if you've ever watched Charlie Sheen in the movie Wall Street, but his character is a classic example of a yuppie. A yuppie stands for young urban professional. These are Americans that are your age that are entering either the office, the business setting, or the high-tech sector. That embrace technology, that live for what is new, what is cutting edge. As you can see from this picture, the fellow here is, of course, talking on his cell phone, probably somewhere in New York, probably getting ready for a business meeting. Yes, that was the original cell phone of the 1980s, what they affectionately known as the brick. So what we have here is America springing back forward, but not all, not all at once. What I mean by all at once, I mean that some sectors continue to decline in this country. Now, this Reagan Revolution, as it is often called, is driven by this singular individual. Reagan is an incredibly popular figure for several reasons. First, he is very affable. He is very approachable. He's constantly optimistic about America's future. He is not shy about self-defacing himself, making fun of his own foibles. But at the same time, he is incredibly strong and vigorous, especially when it comes to foreign policy against expansion of communism and fighting the Soviet Union. When it comes to Reagan's economic policy, it can best be described by supply-side economics. Reagan argued that the problem for the American economy was that manufacturers and businesses were too regulated. I mean, when Reagan came to office in 1981, the federal income tax rate was over 50% for the highest income bracket. That means that half the year, if you made over a certain amount, now you had to make quite a bit of money, but if you worked over a certain amount or made over a certain amount, you paid more than half of your year to the federal government. Reagan argued that that was money that was best used in the private sector, and that these wealthy Americans would reinvest this money in new businesses, reinvest it in expanding existing businesses. This is often called trickle-down economics or voodoo economics. Voodoo economics was actually coined by George Bush Sr. during the 1980 presidential campaign for, the Republican nomination. The idea is that if you give the wealthiest, you give them tax credit or tax breaks, since they're the ones paying the majority of the taxes in the first place, that will free up money in the economy. Of course, critics argue that the rich are getting the lion's share of the tax breaks. So it's an argument, of course, that's still going on today. The other side of Reaganomics, as it was often called, is massive deregulation of certain industries in this country. For example, Reagan deregulated the telephone industry, which helped give rise to the cell phone industry. I mean, one thing that had kept cell phones off the table in the 1970s, that the technology was emerging at that time, was that the economy, or the communications part of the economy, the communications industry, was dominated by Ma Bell. Was dominated by an older company that was, well, dedicated to the traditional landline phone. Deregulation opened up the door for new telecom industries to move in to compete with Ma Bell and eventually kill Ma Bell. Ma Bell was first broken up under anti-monopoly laws, and then finally, South Central Bell went out of existence about 10 years ago. Now, this, of course, didn't come without pain. One of the industries that was deregulated was the airline industry. This meant that some of the working rules that airlines were restricted under meant that they could put more airplanes in the air at one time. This, of course, put great strain upon air traffic controllers. When their contract expired, many of them walked off the job. One thing you've got to understand is air traffic controllers are federal employees. And Reagan took the extraordinary step just to simply fire them all and bring in military air traffic controllers until new civil air traffic controllers were hired. This, of course, brought him no love from that industry. Now, Reagan's rhetoric oftentimes clashed with reality because Reagan often talked about shrinking the economy, bringing more jobs back home. Not shrinking the economy, but building the economy, bringing more back home, and shrinking the role of the federal government, I should say. The problem is during the two terms of Ronald Reagan, the American economy did grow, but it was a sort of a shaky growth. This is best illustrated by Black Monday, October 19th, 1987. The Dow dropped over 500 points in one day, which was close to 1/5. Actually, slightly over 1/5 of the value of the Dow Jones. This was almost as bad as the Black Tuesday, Black Thursday drop of 1929. And many people feared that Great Depression might have ensued, but the American economy bounced back. The American federal government didn't shrink under Ronald Reagan. It actually continued to grow, especially in the military part of the federal government. By 1989, at the end of the Cold War, over 1/4 of the U.S. federal expenditures was directly related to the military, and actually over half was related to the military and defense spending. So, the military took up an enormous part of the federal economy, of the national economy, or the national debt, national economy, national budget. Sorry, getting my tongue tied here, during this time period. So why did the Reagan presidency focus so heavily on defense spending? Well, of course, this goes back to the perceived failure of détente in the late 1970s, the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, the growth of communist insurgencies and coups. For example, the communist takeover of Nicaragua led to a belief among many, especially on the conservative side of American society, that they were facing a new and aggressive USSR that weak presidents, most notably Ford and Carter, had allowed the USSR to basically take advantage of America's post-Vietnam melees. So this, of course, led to massive expenditures aimed at rebuilding the U.S. military, building up the U.S. Navy, and going further when it came to military technology, especially that of nuclear deterrence. Now, the Reagan doctrine can best be boiled down to a military stance of strength, not just containment, but rolling back communism wherever it took hold. We see this in Reagan's push for a 600-ship Navy. By the late 1970s, the majority of the ships in the U.S. fleet were still of World War II vintage. There were new ships coming off the docks or off the ways in the late 1970s, but still a large majority of the destroyers, mini cruisers, and even aircraft carriers were of World War II or immediate post-war vintage. So we have the irony, as you can see in this picture, of the 4 Iowa-class World War II battleships being recommissioned by 1986. However, the majority of the fleet would be renewed with newer ships of the Spruance class, later of the Arleigh Burke class. These are destroyers, of the Ticonderoga anti-aircraft missile cruiser, and of other newer designed ships, like, for example, the Nimitz class aircraft carriers. We also see improvements of our land forces. The M60 main battle tank being phased out in favor of the M1 Abrams, the Bradley fighting vehicle replacing many of the M113 APCs from Vietnam, the Vietnam era. So what we see is basically a revitalization of America's conventional forces, but really the controversy of defense spending revolved around strategic forces and strategic defense. Because during the Reagan era, Reagan would push for a revitalization of our nuclear deterrence in the form of the MX missile program, basically revamping all of the older missiles, taking them out of commission, and putting new missiles in their place. And these new missiles would have MIRV technology. MIRV is an acronym that stands for Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicle. So instead of one missile, one city, you have a missile that can carry 6, 12, some of them, this was later limited by the SALT II treaty, but initially some of American missiles could carry up to 16 independently targeted nuclear warheads. This, of course, escalated the Cold War because immediately the Soviet Union started researching and developing their own MIRV technology. In response to this escalation, the Reagan administration responded by the mid-1980s with what they called the Strategic Defense Initiative. SDI, which was nicknamed, it was derogatorily nicknamed, the Star Wars program by detractors of SDI. SDI was aimed at providing what is often called a missile shield for the United States. This would have been made of ground-based and even space-based weaponry that was aimed at shooting down Soviet missiles before they reached apogee. Apogee is the top, if you will, of the parabolic arc of them launching over the poles and coming back down on the United States. This would have destroyed mutually assured destruction, MAD. If we talked about this in class, I know the textbook speaks about it. MAD was the policy, an informal policy that had developed during the Cold War era, where both sides had built up enormous nuclear stockpiles on the assumption that no one would be foolish enough to initiate a first strike for fear that the counterstrike of the surviving weapons would still be sizable enough to take out the superpower that initiated the nuclear war. But what would happen if one side had a missile shield? Well, the other side would be basically castrated. Their deterrent forces of nuclear missiles would be seen as impotent. Many feared that the Soviets might strike as we emplaced our missile shield. So you're bringing the shield up. It's not in place yet. The Soviets might strike before that missile shield was operational. And of course, many believed that, many detractors of Reagan believed that it would give incentive for American commanders to initiate a war on our terms if we believed that we could survive a nuclear war. This is where movies like, for example, War Games and Spies Like Us came from. These, of course, are Hollywood criticisms of the mad mentality on both sides, as well as making fun of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, one of the last things that the Reagan administration had to deal with, of course, was the Middle East. In the far Middle East, next to China, the United States would side with the Mujahideen. At first, sending American-made clones of Soviet small arms to Afghanistan so that they could not track them back to the Americans. We wanted plausible deniability of our support for the Mujahideen. However, by the late 1980s, the United States was openly supporting the Mujahideen by sending some of our most high-tech man-portable weapons, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, to the Mujahideen. This, of course, would come back and bite the United States, because the way in which we moved money and munitions to Afghanistan involved third parties, and one of those third parties was a construction firm in Saudi Arabia led by the bin Laden family. Yes, Osama bin Laden worked for the American CIA. He was the money bag man between Afghanistan and the American ally Saudi Arabia. And many of those that would go on to join Al-Qaeda received training and weapons from the CIA. Now, further, closer to Europe, in what we often think of the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United States had to deal with a new tactic. Starting in the late 1970s, but picking up speed in the 1980s, terrorist groups had resorted, instead of trying to out-and-out fight American-supported governments, like, for example, the government that came to power after the 1973 Yom Kippur War in Egypt, or the Israelis. These radical Islamic terrorist groups would turn to taking hostages, hijacking aircraft, or attacking civilian targets with basically suicide bombers, or blowing planes up. Of course, we call this terrorism. In the military, they call this asymmetric warfare. And of course, this is something that America had to deal with throughout the 1980s. Now, what are some of the things that are going on at home? Well, the 1980s, of course, became a big, one of the big issues of the 1980s was the continued fight over women's rights. Women had gained, of course, the right to vote in the 1920s. In the 1970s, they had fought for the ERA. By the 1980s, two issues took prominence in the fight for women's rights. The first, and it's the lesser of the two, was the perceived glass ceiling, this argument that we're still having today over whether women, for example, get paid less for the same job than men do. Is there an invisible barrier for women to rise through the ranks? Modern feminists of the 1980s argued that the boardroom was kind of a good old boys network, that they would not, of course, allow women to break through a certain level into the upper echelons of business. Of course, the counter-argument is that men are willing to put in the long hours necessary to rise through the corporate ranks, not taking off breaks for taking care of children, or, having children, for example. So, if you're willing to work 50, 60, 70 hours a week and never see your family, that will, of course, get you into the corporate boardroom. So this is still, if these sound familiar, these are still the same counter-arguments, one versus the other, that we're having today. Just like the issue of abortion is still a hot topic issue. In the 1980s, This was the first decade after, of course, the landmark Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion. And so increasingly in the 1980s, you see the, quote, pro-life movement challenging the, quote, pro-choice movement. Pro-choice, of course, as the name suggests, argued that women have the right to choose what to do with their bodies. The pro-life movement, as they called themselves, argued that that choice ends when you have a third party involved, father, mother, and, of course, they argued that the child is alive. This is where you see, of course, protesters and counter-protesters outside abortion clinics. The Supreme Court weighed in. It was legal. And the American legislature, or Congress, of course, was split evenly as well. So it became sort of a static, constantly controversial issue in the 1980s. Now, the issue of gay rights changed radically in the 1980s with the discovery of AIDS and HIV. AIDS and HIV, of course, became a hot topic and moral issue in the 1980s. Because throughout the 1980s, those that opposed gay rights, conservatives, for example, social conservatives, argued that AIDS just highlighted the sinful and destructive behavior of gays and lesbians. They highlighted, of course, the club scene in places like San Francisco that would lead to the explosion of AIDS. And part of their argument had some fact behind it. Many gay Americans had to come to realize that there was a small minority within their own culture that was contributing to the, what you might call, spread of the disease. But of course, this was also true in Americans that were heterosexual and practiced what you might call unsafe sex, as well as intravenous drug users. So it wasn't really a moral issue, it was a behavior issue. How would you expose yourself to the disease? And since, of course, AIDS is spread by blood and sex, if, of course, you take risky behaviors like unprotected sex or multiple partners, as well as shooting up on heroin, this puts you at greater chance for the spread of the disease. But, of course, this issue, again, since AIDS struck the gay community seemingly first, was used as sort of a crowbar in which to split Americans apart over the issue. Now, what about other minorities? What about the largest minority in the 1980s, black Americans? Well, the issue of continuing poverty in America was combined with the rise in the drug culture and the prevalence of inner-city gangs. We have, of course, since we are using movies to illustrate points, we have movies like Colors, Spike Lee film. We have, of course, black advocates pointing out that the inner city, the ghetto, the projects are just basically centers for crime, despair, and drug use. Many Americans, even on the left, started to question what went wrong with the Great Society. Why, with all of this massive government spending on social programs, do we still not only have the continuation of poverty in black America, but in some cases it has gotten worse? This, of course, brought up many tense issues. Can you just solve poverty by throwing money at it? Or, as many conservatives argued, was the actual putting money in the hands of the poor actually destroying their work ethic? Was it actually undercutting and eroding the social bedrock that makes, American neighborhoods, American communities strong and prosperous, instead creating what is often called a culture of dependency? Even some that had pushed and voted for, the Great Society programs, like, for example, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan had been LBJ's Secretary of Labor and one of the staunchest supporters of his Great Society programs and anti-poverty programs. But in I want to say 1968, let me find it real quick. Actually, in 1965, and of course this was revisited in 1976, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. And what Moynihan pointed out, especially after 1976, was that how anti-poverty programs were conducted, how the money was distributed, was actually destroying one of the cornerstones of American culture, especially in Black America. And this, of course, is the American family. He argued that poverty was becoming, quote, feminized because anti-poverty programs were aimed at children and their mothers. And thus, if you had a breadwinner in the home, I should say, if you were a single, or not a single mother, but if you were a mother but you had a man there making money, you actually got less money and were kind of pushed down on the priority list for help than somebody who walked in and did not have that second income. And thus there was an incentive, according to Moynihan and other critics of anti-poverty programs, there was an incentive for basically women to be single when they had kids. And thus we see a feminization of the poor. This is an issue we're still dealing with today, guys. One of the things that lecturing about the 80s and 90s, I'm basically trying to throw out both sides of the issue here so that you guys understand that unlike past history where we have some consensus over what happened and the reasons why, that consensus is not here when we talk about the 80s and 90s. Now, the 80s are also a time period of a lot of scandals, including the presidency. In the 1980s, we have the SNL crisis, not the Saturday Night Live crisis, but the savings and loan crisis. In the late 1970s, the Federal Reserve raised rates on banks. Banks are different from savings and loan institutions. Savings and loan institutions were a different economic animal, if you will, than a traditional bank. Banks, of course, had the ability to invest money, to loan out money. Even though savings and loans had that ability, they were not regulated the same way as traditional banks, so that the interest rates on savings and loans were actually better than those from traditional banks. And so from the 1970s to the mid to late 1980s, many Americans put their savings, they invested their life savings, their pensions, in these savings and loans in order to get a better interest rate than those at banks. The problem is, not being regulated the same way as banks, the savings and loans, well, many of them did invested in some very risky ventures. There was a lot of skimming off the top. This is best illustrated by this man right here. This is Charles Keating. Charles Keating and others like Michael Milken were very much interested in, well, playing fast and loose with other people's monies. Charles Keating was the head of the Lincoln Savings and Loan Association, which controlled numerous savings and loans around the country. And in 1986, 1987, the Lincoln Loan Association went belly up. And of course there was investigations, but the major problem with the savings and loans is that they were not as well protected as banks. Bank accounts are protected by FDIC insurance. While savings and loans have a similar insurance system, it is not as you don't get as much back, let's just put it that way, as you would if you had your money in the bank. So a lot of people saw their life savings wasted and basically flushed down the toilet. Also, in the 1980s, especially the late 1980s, we see, of course, the rise of the televangelist. It's sort of a phenomenon of the 1980s. But by the late 1980s, we see that many of these televangelists, like James Baker and Jimmy Swaggart, are either financially corrupt or they get caught with hookers in their car or whatever. And of course, this is a major slap in the face to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, this religious new right, which of course used this sort of moral position to argue politics. And many had looked to leaders like James Baker and Jimmy Swaggart to be sort of the spiritual face of this movement, only to have the embarrassment of these scandals break out in the late 1980s. Now, the biggest scandal involved the president. This was, of course, the Iran-Contra scandal. This scandal, which hit the sort of American TV between August of 1985 and March of 1987, involved the United States government, the Reagan administration, using weapon sales to the Contras in South America, because the U.S. Congress had cut off sales to the rebels fighting against Nicaraguan communists that had taken control in Nicaragua. The U.S. was effectively selling guns to the Contras. Actually, I take that back. They were selling guns to the Iranians, who the United States officially had an arms embargo against. We were selling guns to the Iranians under the table to secure the release of hostages in Iran at the same time as creating money for the support of the Contras. This is a classic CIA operation right here, where the federal government the federal Congress basically says, we're not going to fund the Contras, we're going to ban sales to Iran. The CIA wanting to fund anti-communist fighters in Nicaragua go behind the scenes, one of these black operations, one of these off-the-books operations, selling guns to Iran behind the scenes to use that money to fund the Contras in South America, actually Central America. However, when this broke in 1985, 1986, many believed that Reagan might get impeached. However, Reagan came out and even won the 1986 presidency handedly, earning him the nickname the Teflon President. Now, let's talk about the end of the Cold War. As I've already mentioned, Reagan was a very staunch anti-communist, and during his first term was often seen as a president that would lead us into World War III. I can remember there was a 3-part television miniseries called The Day After, where basically it is World War III happening, and that's the first episode. And the next couple of episodes are about what America would be like if all American cities were destroyed in a nuclear catastrophe and telephones, electricity, water, infrastructure didn't work. Because many on the American left believed that Reagan was going to wind up getting us into a war. Now, Reagan's militaristic and bellicose statements were aimed at sort of driving the Soviets in a certain direction, because this is something that Reagan did on purpose. Reagan purposely made the Soviets question whether or not they were going to have to fight or not. So when, in 1986, Reagan put forward an olive branch of opening up negotiations for reduction of nuclear weapons, the Soviets took hold of that. And it wasn't just any Soviet leader that became Reagan's sort of counterpart in this ending of the Cold War. It was this man right here. This is Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev or Gorbachev, depending on how you want to pronounce it, can best be described as a new Soviet leader. The Soviet leadership by the mid-1980s had gotten old and stale. Let's put it this way. Nikita Khrushchev, of course, had been of the same generation as Joseph Stalin. Nikita Khrushchev was alive at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. His successor, who came to power in the mid-1960s, Leonid Brezhnev, was the same age as Khrushchev. Brezhnev famously was a heavy drinker who would often call up Richard Nixon on the red line that was installed after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is actually a phone line that is a direct connection between the Kremlin and the White House. And being drunk out of his mind, Brezhnev would often talk to Richard Nixon during his presidency about, let's just go ahead and start World War III and get it over with, and Nixon would have to talk him down. When I watched an interview about, it was an interview of Nixon's Soviet, I should say Russian translator, an American translator who would translate what Brezhnev was saying. This guy basically said on 2 or 3 occasions Brezhnev would call up and it's like, this guy was drunk. And here Nixon is basically talking him down. Brezhnev, of course, would be the Soviet premier until 1985 when he died. His replacement, Yuri Andropov, would live less than a year because Andropov was even older than Brezhnev. His replacement, Konstantin Chernenko, lived less than half a year because Chernenko was the same age as Andropov and Brezhnev. To put it bluntly, guys, these guys were old, and they did not represent the average Soviet citizen of their day. So Gorbachev, who was born and lived through World War II but not old enough to serve, he was seen as a breath of fresh air. And he also came to the leadership of the Soviet Union with 2 new policies. Gorbachev realized that the Soviet economic system didn't work. It was broke. So, Stalin-esque, Stalin-era policies just did not work. By the 1980s, there were bread lines and food lines in every major Soviet city. The Soviets lived basically in hamster houses, these monolithic apartment complexes that looked like inner-city projects. If you owned a car, you owned a little Lada. These were little cars that are about the size of a VW Beetle and incredibly unreliable. They were so unreliable that most of them were trashed after the 1990s that now they're collector items. Gorbachev wanted to revitalize the Soviet system. Now, make no bones about it, Mikhail Gorbachev was a believer in communism. He believed that the central government should direct all economic activity, but he wanted the Soviet people to feel invested in the system, to be able to give feedback, to feel that this was their system, not just a system directed by people in Moscow and forced upon them. This is why one of his most important, at least he thought it was most important, economic systems was perestroika. Perestroika was an economic policy where the Soviet government would maintain control of transportation, banking, communications, major industries, but would allow your average Soviet to have small businesses, to have a flower shop, to have a meat shop, to have a shoe shop, to have their own business. Yes, they would buy their supplies and buy their stuff from the government-owned consortiums, but they would be invested in the system. Now, what about those people who still worked for the government-owned factories? Well, this is where glasnost came into play. Glasnost literally means openness, and it was a policy where Soviet citizens were given the right, and I use that word right loosely, to complain, to voice their opinions, to talk about things that needed to be changed. This meant that within the Soviet Union itself, we see a slight liberalization of policy when it came to television programs and especially the press. It allowed for private pamphlets to be published, and most importantly, it allowed for certain television shows and print media from the West to be allowed into the Soviet Union. Now keep that in mind, guys. Now, in foreign policy, Gorbachev had to deal with the continuing Soviet war in Afghanistan. So Gorbachev is kind of in the same position as Richard Nixon was in Vietnam. He's trying to get the Soviets out of this very destructive war. It's a war that is made even more painful by the fact that the United States is supplying the Mujahideen with weapons that make it almost impossible for the Soviets to win. And just like in Vietnam, the reason why the Soviets pull out in 1988 is because of a decline in public support for that war. And again, this shows you the power of glasnost. Because if it wasn't for glasnost, the Soviet government wouldn't give a flying rat's patoot about what the Soviet population wanted. They wouldn't hear about it. But because of glasnost, Soviet citizens could voice their opinion that this war sucked. And so in 1988, Gorbachev ordered the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. Of course, by 1989, 1990, that would lead to the fall of the communist government of Afghanistan, leading to the rise of factionalism in that country, and of course that would help lead to the rise of Al-Qaeda. Now, in relations to relations with the United States, this is where again the olive branch offered by Reagan would be accepted by Gorbachev, because starting in 1987, the United States would negotiate a series of treaties that Reagan and then later his successor, George H.W. Bush, would sign. The most famous one is this one you see here, the signing of. This is the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Basically, this banned all battlefield nuclear missiles. During the Cold War, you had the ICBMs that were located in each country, but you also had these intermediate range missiles that could be launched by field commanders. The INF Treaty basically removed those and took away the possibility that a regional nuclear exchange would lead to a global nuclear exchange. Later on, after, of course, Reagan left office in 1989, we would see the signing of the START Treaty. The START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, would be similar to the past SALT I and the abortive SALT II treaties. Basically, it would not just reduce or limit the number of nuclear weapons, it would start to reduce the number of nuclear warheads, and it recognized not just missiles, but actual warheads. So this is the treaty that limits the number of MIRVs, you know, these individual warheads that can be put on each missile. Now, of course, 1988 was an election year in the United States. 1988 would bring George Herbert Walker Bush, father of George W. Bush, to the presidency. Most famously, he would run on the campaign slogan of "Read my lips, no new taxes." And this would cost him the 1992 election because between 1988 and 1992, George Bush would sign one of the largest tax increases since Reagan's tax cuts. Now, it would be Bush who would benefit from the policies of previous presidents, including Ronald Reagan, because it was under Bush's first term, actually his first year in office, that we would see the official end of the Cold War. And instead of going out in a blaze of glory, instead of going out in a nuclear exchange, the Cold War kind of just petered out. So what happened? Well, glasnost happened. Because it's not just an opening of the Soviet Union that Glasnost allowed. We see the Western press penetrating those Eastern countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania. Well, not Romania, but Bulgaria. We see those in Eastern Europe, Eastern European countries, seeing the West for the first time. They're seeing that the West is not worse off than they are, that the East is not this workers' paradise, but instead, looking at American newspapers, looking at German magazines, looking at television shows from Western countries, like, for example, the TV show Dallas is incredibly popular in both the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Americans see just the opposite of what their leaders want them to see. Their leaders want them to think that the communist countries are, again, a workers' paradise. One reason why they allow Dallas to be aired in the Soviet Union is, well, Dallas has a bunch of characters that are rich and spoiled and constantly scheming against each other. And they want that to be the message that their citizens see. But instead, what their citizens see is, yes, they have a bunch of scheming rich people. Well, so does the Soviet Union. But the big difference is that all of the workers and the maids for the people, the side characters, if you will, the poorer characters, they would be rich in the Soviet Union because they have cars. They may not live in the mansions that you see on Dallas, but they live in nice houses. They have TVs. They go to grocery stores and they don't have to wait for food. That's what the people in the Eastern Bloc countries see. So what we see here is that the people of the East are waking up from a nightmare. They're waking up from this era of communist control that had blinded them to what the world had become. This is why in 1988 and 1989, we of course see the rise in opposition groups. For example, Lech Walesa, I'm not expecting you to be able to pronounce or even spell his name, had been the leader of the Polish independent union Solidarity. Now, Solidarity had been outlawed by the early 1980s, and Lech Walesa, who I actually got to see speak in person at Texas A&M, Lech Walesa had been arrested and thrown in prison for several years. However, by 1988, he was released. Solidarity was legalized. The hope was that Poland would have elections and that Solidarity would win a few seats, and the combination of a communist majority and a Solidarity minority would re-legitimize the government, and Poland as a communist country would continue on. However, when these elections were held in August of 1989, Solidarity won every seat except for one. So overnight, Poland became a non-communist country. Likewise, we see problems in other Eastern Bloc countries. For example, in May of 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria. Now, Austria had not been a NATO country, but it was still a Western country. From the beginnings of the Cold War all the way up to 1989, the border between Western Europe and Eastern Europe was basically an armed wall. I mean, seriously, these countries were divided by a no-man's land, barbed wire, fences, and guard towers. And so when Hungary opened its borders, it allowed for those in Eastern Europe to at first go and visit Western Europe, but then many started to stay in Western Europe. This is especially true for those in Germany, because the Germans realize that, hey, we can travel freely between one communist country to another. This is something that they were allowed to do for the most part, even during the height of the Cold War. They just couldn't travel to Western Europe. So Germans traveled to Hungary, and then traveled to Austria, and then traveled to West Germany, many to stay. This became known as the Pan-European picnic, as Eastern Europeans, especially East Germans, went to Western Europe, especially West Germany, and saw that they lived in an awful mirror image of what Western Europe actually was. This pan-European picnic, which started around August 19th, 1989, caused such a problem for the Eastern European or the East German government that in October of 1989, the leader of East Germany, Erich Honecker, closed the border between not West Germany and East Germany. That border had always been closed, but between East Germany and Hungary. This, of course, led to a breakout of demonstrations throughout East Germany, especially Berlin, because the East Germans wanted the right to at least go and visit West Germany, if not move to West Germany. Before Honecker closed the border, there was one family I remember reading about. They left East Berlin. They traveled to Hungary. They traveled to Austria. They traveled to West Germany. They got sanctuary status, basically green card status in West Germany, which allowed them to go without being molested through East Germany on those trains we talked about to West Berlin, where they got an apartment where they could look across the Berlin Wall right here. This is the Berlin Wall at their old apartment. They wanted to be in Berlin. They just didn't want to be in East Berlin. So what we see is these demonstrations growing. And by November of 1989, both East Germans and West Germans, I should say, let me correct that, East Berliners and West Berliners are protesting and demonstrating at the wall itself. They're basically egging the border guards, the East German border guards, to shoot them. And the scary thing is Erich Honecker contemplated actually sending troops to put down these demonstrations throughout East Germany and do so violently, basically declare war on his own population. However, when those orders were given, the East German generals and even the head of the Stasi, this is their KGB, refused to carry it out. This is why in 1989, West Germany had to quickly kind of absorb East Germany because its government fell apart overnight. And this is not the only government that changed. In November of 1989, we have the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, where two things happen. Czechoslovakia abandons communism and breaks in two between the now Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. Really the only violent revolution occurs in Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu, who had been a very hardcore leader, who had even criticized Mikhail Gorbachev's policies. He was a Stalinist. Not Mikhail Gorbachev, but Nicolae Ceausescu was violently overthrown by his own military. And this was carried live on CNN. And I actually got to see Nicolae Ceausescu gunned down because they didn't know they were going to do it. The CNN camera guys that were there didn't know they were going to do it until the guns were already firing. Very kind of shocking video. So let's do just a quick overview of what was going on in the post-Cold War period. The Soviet Union still was around in 1989. However, in 1991 it would cease to exist. Between August and December of 1991, we see, of course, the fragmentation and dissolution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, I use the USSR's full name on purpose because the Soviet Union was not a monolithic country. It was a union of Soviet republics. Here is a map of them. The biggest one in pink is Russia, but we also have Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, the Stans down here. Kazakhstan is the largest one, Georgia, Azerbaijan down here. Starting in mid-1991, we see, because again of the effect of this openness that Glasnost had allowed, Soviet citizens start to reject the Soviet system. And this is especially true in the Baltic states. The Baltic states had been conquered after the invasion of Poland by the Soviet Union, by Stalin. And the people there brutalized by Stalin before and, of course, after World War II. In mid-1989, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia voted to secede from the Soviet Union. This sets off a a flow, if you will, a snowball effect that very quickly escalates to Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and the rest. These are numbered in the order that they declared their independence from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is falling apart. And so, in late 1991, hardline communist leaders put Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest as he's vacationing down here on the Black Sea. They attempt to restore the Soviet Union by calling out the Soviet Red Army to quell these demonstrations taking place throughout the country. They're even taking place in Moscow because you have those in Russia, basically what we think of as the Soviet Union, who want to secede from the Soviet Union. And this falls apart. This coup falls apart. I got to watch this on TV, and I was one of them. I was scared to death that these hardliners would take control and we'd have a Cold War again. But these hardliners are brought to heel because of men like this. This is Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was the president, not of the Soviet Union, but he was president of Russia. Because each one of these republics had their own president, and then you had the premier of the Soviet Union, which at the time was Mikhail Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin famously climbed on one of the Red Army tanks because the Red Army was starting to turn against the hardliners. Because as these other non-Russian peoples declared their independence, those Latvians, Lithuanians, Kazakhs that were in the Red Army, they said, hey, my country left, and I actually agree with them. I want to go, and I don't want to be in Moscow. So the Red Army turns against these hardliners and support Boris Yeltsin. And this is Boris Yeltsin standing on top of a tank. What he is doing is he is declaring the secession of Russia from the Soviet Union. Now, Moscow is in Russia. The majority of the Soviet Union was Russia. So this very act right here meant that the Soviet Union just ceased to exist, except for these guys that were holed up back here, who, after Boris Yeltsin made this grand speech, the tanks would turn their guns on this parliamentary building and start shelling it until the hardliners gave up. So the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Many argue that this was an era of lost possibilities, that what had been the communist Eastern European countries could have been remade, because the 90s were a time period of instability in Eastern Europe. One reason why Vladimir Putin is so popular among Russians is because the Yeltsin presidency was incredibly unstable. Putin brought back stability in the 2000s, and with stability came economic prosperity to a degree. So while Putin is nowhere near a Democrat, nowhere near a Western liberal, the people of Russia vote for him because he is a strong leader that, unlike the communists, he is allowing the Russian people to benefit from this better economy that they have, that they didn't have in the 1980s. Now, one of the things that we see in the 1990s as well is globalization. We see, of course, a greater role for the United Nations. We see the growth in non-governmental organizations or NGOs like Amnesty International or Greenpeace. These are either supranational organizations or strong organizations that are not backed by any nation. We see the rise in the European Union, which is a confederation of Western European states. The criticisms of the European Union is that its structure is very non-democratic, because you still have, quote, the individual nations. You elect your leaders of those individual nations under the European Union, but many of the laws that are passed by the EU Coordinating Committee, which is appointed by the bureaucrats that administer the European Union. These are individuals that are not voted on. Yes, you have a European Parliament, but they're mainly an advisory body to the European Commission, which is really the government of the EU. This is why, just recently, Many in Britain, about 51–52%, it was a very close vote, but the majority of people in Britain voted to break away from the European Union. This is what Brexit was. What's affecting the United States? Well, we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is passed in 1991 and actually 1992, 1993. This was an agreement whereupon there would be no economic restrictions between trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Ross Perot, who ran for president as an independent in 1992, argued that if NAFTA was passed, you would hear a giant sucking sound, as he called it, as American jobs left for Mexico. And he was partially correct. A lot of American factories went south. Now, what about the post-Cold War era? Well, many in this country, including yours truly, had hoped that the end of the Cold War would mean that, hey, maybe we can have some peace. The problem is the end of the Cold War had just the opposite effect. The first problem is that it was very hard to demobilize our military and industrial complex. Too many people's jobs were tied up in defense spending. There were, entire towns in this country where the economy was based around the military base or air base that was located there. So if you started closing bases, the economies of entire cities in this country would be fundamentally harmed. If you started scaling back massively on military spending, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Raytheon, General Dynamics especially, these companies, their profits were almost exclusively coming from the sale of military hardware to the United States and its allies. Even companies like General Electric, large portions of their money came from military contracts. And the other thing that caused the end of the Cold War not to be the end or the beginnings of peace is that the Cold War, ironically enough, actually held certain people in check. The Cold War actually did stabilize the world. I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but one reason why the Persian Gulf War broke out in 1990, where you have Iraq under Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait, is that up until 1990, the Soviet Union had been giving Iraq a lot of money. The United States initially had funded Iraq's war against Iran starting in 1980, but by the late 1980s, the United States had pulled out and Saddam Hussein had looked to the Soviets to rebuild his military after that very destructive war between these two countries. However, by 1989-1990, the Soviets started cutting off the money. And so Saddam started getting loans from his fellow Arab neighbors, most notably Kuwait. When Kuwait started to say, hey, you need to pay back your loans, Saddam's, response was simply to invade Kuwait. Of course, this would lead to American involvement and continued American involvement in that part of the world. We also see, of course, not all Eastern European countries peacefully abandoning communism. In the mid to late 1990s, we see, of course, breakout of violence as Yugoslavia, a country made up of multiple ethnicities, Montenegrins, Croats, Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, various other groups. Yugoslavia breaks apart. And as each of these groups fight for the spoils, we see, of course, violence and genocide. They coined the term ethnic cleansing, but what it was genocide. It was a Holocaust. And so what we have is a situation where, does the U.S. get involved? Our European allies definitely wanted us to get involved because of fear that this would spread to other parts of Europe. And so presidents like George Bush and later Bill Clinton had to deal with, of course, what do we do? What side do we take? Of course, the Balkan Wars of the 90s would be resolved with the Dayton Peace Accords, which nominally ended all of the fighting there. What about other parts of the world? Well, in Asia and especially in Africa, many of the leaders of these countries had depended upon one superpower or the other for aid to keep their economies and keep themselves in power. And during the Cold War, of course, the United States or the Soviet Union gladly gave military arms and money to these countries in order to keep the other side from doing the same and, checking that off their scorecard of the Cold War. However, starting in 1989, both sides started to scale back and end their money and weapons sales to these countries, especially in Asia. And that's why in the 1990s we see entire countries descending into chaos. This is where Black Hawk Down comes from. This is why Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, Zaire, what is today Congo, all descend into violence because they are no longer able, the leaders of these countries no longer able to keep themselves in power. And we see resistance groups rising up against them. Well, I'm going to skip this right here. If you want to read about the decade of Whitewater, I will advise you to do this, but I want to just continue on and talk about some of the old issues that pop back up in the absence of Cold War fears. Of course, the 1970s, we see the rise of the environmental movement, and we see this reemerge in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War period, with the fear of global warming. Now, of course, today we, of course, see a much more environmentally conscious society, especially here in the United States, but this is still a controversial issue. We don't hear much about, quote, global warming anymore. We hear about climate change. And the reason for that is because just recently the science behind global warming has been brought into doubt. Much of the data that was used for the initial science behind the theory of global warming has been shown to be, quote, assumed rather than proven. So this is one of the problems because Western policies, say for example, how your car is built, is based upon this science. And there is, of course, should be debate over, car design, laws restricting, say, incandescent light bulbs, low-flow toilets. All of these things, of course, come from this new environmental consciousness. While I personally am not a believer in global warming, I do think that there is an environmental crisis. And the biggest thing I believe, and I think this is provable, is that we live in a throwaway society. Everything you buy today is made out of plastic. Plastic, while is technically recyclable, it isn't recycled. The reason for that, it is cheaper to make the plastic the first go-around than to recycle it. Unlike steel, copper, which it's cheaper to take that and recycle than make new steel or copper. It's cheaper actually to make new plastic than to recycle old plastic. So there's not a cost incentive or a profit incentive to using that. Also, steel, copper, these are natural elements. Wood, it's a natural element. Wood, paper, it rots. Steel, it corrodes. Plastic, we really don't know what happens to it. Different plastics react in different ways. Some plastics never rot. Some break down into little bitty bits that are dangerous to wildlife. We have an entire island of trash made up mainly of plastic that has washed out to sea from, actually it's over here in the Pacific, so it's right here. That is washed out to sea from not only the United States, but from Latin America as well as the Pacific. And because of the tidal flows here, the ocean currents here, it's kind of like a toilet bowl. It all keeps it clustered around. Now, this island of trash, you can't get out and walk on it, but it is incredibly dangerous to sail through. People, fishing vessels have gotten stuck out there, and of course it's incredibly dangerous to wildlife. So this is another issue that we have to worry about. AIDS is another major issue that we have to worry about. If you look at this map here at the very top, this is a prevalence of AIDS as a percentage of the population. And this is confirmed AIDS cases. And if you look at Southern Africa, especially South Africa, over 1/3 of the population has the disease. And this is only the recorded examples. So this is a major problem because we may experience massive depopulation and a continued problem of AIDS. The whole reason why the United States went into Somalia up here, actually Somalia is the horn right here, is because of another issue, hunger issues. Americans don't like to see hunger. This is why in the 1980s we had aid to Africa, feed the, you don't need to hear me sing. But you had Hollywood and the media wanting to, of course, send economic and food aid to Africa. This is why Bono from YouTube is constantly over there. And this is why the United States sent military forces to Somalia to try and distribute aid, which eventually led to the Black Hawk Down incident. Now the big major change, and this is, I think, not just something that is my opinion, but I think it's something that I think you guys will agree with, is the rise of the internet. When I went to college in 1993, there was no such thing as the internet as we know it today. There was the Gopher net. Basically, it was email. I had a Gopher account that I could talk to my other students, I could talk to my fellow students, I could talk to my professors. But in 1994, the internet came to town, and I remember when it did. And it was nothing like what we have today. It was mainly the ability to look up text documents. You had hyperlinks that you could go to other text documents. But during the course of my time at UT, from 1995, when the internet was kind of really there, to me leaving in 2001, the internet really came of age. You had, of course, by 2001, you had pretty decent pictures. You had streaming video. YouTube was just being started in 2001. And one of the questions is, how did the internet change the world? Well, that's something that I'm going to leave you guys to think about. I can't really answer that because it's still changing the world. But who built the internet? Well, that is also up for debate. The internet, as we know it, got started as a government program in the 1960s. To tie government, military, and educational institutions together in their continued quest to fight the Cold War. Basically, it was a secure network to send information, like, for example, research data about nuclear weapons, for example. However, in the late 1980s, this DARPA stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration. This DARPA-inspired link between these institutions was opened up, the bare bones of it, if you will, was opened up to private businesses to build upon. So in a way, the government did have a role to play. But the internet we have today is nothing like this right here. Basically, what that DARPA network was what I had when I went to UT. It was basically email, and it was email that all you could send were text messages and text files. You couldn't send pictures. So really, who built the internet, which is all-encompassing, streaming video, Hulu, Netflix, being able to get on eBay and buy stuff? Well, it was companies like eBay, which got it started in 1998. It was companies that started forum boards and things like that. But according to one journal article I read, one of the biggest industries that pushed was not Al Gore. Al Gore, of course, is criticized for saying that he helped build the internet. He helped vote on this DARPA network. In reality, it was men like this. This is Larry Flynt, the founder of Hustler. And the reason why I have Larry Flynt here is because Larry Flynt, his empire of multiple magazines is enormous online. One journal article that I was reading was looking at the amount of internet traffic and internet websites that the internet consisted of. In 2002, this was a journal written after 2009, but in 2002, almost but not quite, 1/4 of all internet websites were porn related, and close to half of all internet traffic was going to porn. So it was an enormous industry. Think about this. You want, if you are a consumer of his product, you want high quality, anonymous pictures and streaming video in your home. This is why these websites had streaming video. That's why they had high quality pictures. That's their bread and butter. That's how they made their money. So they were pushing this. Now today, after 2008, with the sort of creation of social media, started out with MySpace, which is now dead, but Twitter, Facebook, and the like, that same journal article said that while pornography is still a sizable part of the internet, is nowhere near what it was. Right now, the majority of the internet is social media. Social media has displaced porn, but still it is there. So that's why I have Al Gore up here, you know, kind of ticked off, because he's wrong. He's claiming he built the internet. No, it was Larry Flint. Now, I'm going to stop here, guys. But if you guys want to continue on, you can think about some of these issues that are brought up in these slides. For example, the case of Clarence Thomas, the O.J. Simpson trial, the Rodney King trial. You know, what about some of the backlash against the government, Oklahoma City, and then finally, you know, or I should say, the Ruby Ridge standoff, the disaster at Waco, and then finally the bombing at Oklahoma City. But I think we've talked about enough, since this is mainly going to be used for your extra credit. But remember, everything prior to 1989 and the end of the Cold War will be on the test itself. Okay, guys, I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you very much.